The story of Japan's Type 95 Hago light tank begins in the early 1930s, at a time when the Imperial Japanese Army sought to modernize its mechanized forces in line with the fast-moving doctrines it had observed in Europe. Following lessons learned from the Manchurian Incident of 1931, Japanese commanders recognized that armored mobility would be essential for operations across the vast plains of Manchuria and the rugged landscapes of northern China. Yet the Army's principal tank of that era, the Type 89 Igo medium tank, was slow, underpowered, and built primarily for infantry support. It used a gasoline engine, moved at a mere 15 kilometers per hour, and could not match the envisioned pace of motorized infantry columns. In 1933, the Army's Technical Bureau issued specifications for a new light tank capable of speeds over 40 kilometers per hour and reliable operation in extreme climates. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was selected to develop the prototype under the guidance of Chief Engineer Tomio Hara, an innovative designer whose earlier work on the Type 92 heavy armored car had introduced several mechanical advancements. Hara's key breakthrough was the bell crank suspension, a compact and flexible system using pairs of bogie wheels connected through vertical coil springs. This layout provided smoother travel over uneven ground while allowing the hull to remain light. The prototype completed trials in 1934, officially designated as the Type 95 light tank, Hago. Type 95 corresponding to the Japanese Imperial Year 2595. The Hago weighed roughly 7.4 tons and measured 4.38 meters long, 2.06 meters wide, and 2.13 meters tall. It was powered by a six-cylinder air-cooled Mitsubishi diesel engine producing 120 horsepower at 1,800 RPM. Granting a maximum road speed of 45 kilometers per hour and a range of 250 kilometers on internal fuel. The choice of diesel power distinguished Japanese armor from most contemporaries, as it reduced fire risk and simplified logistics in fuel-scarce theaters. Armament consisted of a 37mm Type 94 tank gun in a hand-cranked turret, complemented by two 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns, one mounted in the hull front and one in the turret rear for anti-infantry defense. The turret could traverse 360 degrees manually, though its small diameter limited crew efficiency. The Hago's three-man crew, commander, gunner, loader in the turret, driver in the front left hull, and machine gunner radio operator to his right, operated in cramped conditions with minimal ventilation. Armor thickness ranged from 6 to 12 millimeters, sufficient only against rifle and machine gun fire. Weight savings were prioritized over protection, in keeping with Japanese doctrine that emphasized speed and aggressive tactics rather than armor endurance. Production commenced in 1936 at Mitsubishi's Sagami Arsenal and related subcontractors, eventually totaling approximately 2,300 units through 1943. Early field deployments occurred during the Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937-1945, where the Hago proved effective against poorly equipped Chinese nationalist forces. In engagements around Shanghai, Nanking, and Wuhan, Chinese defenders possessed few dedicated anti-tank weapons, and the Hago's mobility allowed it to exploit gaps in urban lines or outflank entrenched positions. The 37mm gun, firing armor-piercing rounds at 600 meters per second, easily destroyed sandbag bunkers and machine gun nests. Infantry morale often collapsed at the sudden appearance of tanks, an advantage Japan used to great psychological effect. The apparent success in China reinforced the Army's belief that light tanks could dominate Asian battlefields. Japanese armored doctrine, rooted in infantry support rather than independent armored warfare, treated tanks as mobile firepower platforms for advancing foot soldiers. Consequently, the Type 95 received minimal radio equipment and relied on flag or hand signal communication. These choices, adequate in the 1930s, would prove disastrous when Japan later faced mechanized adversaries who coordinated through wireless command nets. The first major test of Japan's tank technology against a modern opponent came not in the Pacific, but on the Mongolian steppe during the Nomonhan incident, Khe Sanh of 1939. Here, Japanese forces clashed with the Soviet Red Army in a border conflict that escalated into one of the largest armored confrontations prior to World War II. Opposing the Ha-Go and its heavier companion, the Type 89 medium, were Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 fast tanks equipped with 45mm guns and armor up to 20mm thick. The terrain, flat and open, nullified Japan's traditional advantages of speed and maneuver through restricted spaces. When the battle intensified in August 1939, Soviet artillery and tank fire devastated Japanese armor, and the 37mm guns of the Ha-Go could not penetrate Soviet frontal armor beyond 300 meters, while 45mm Soviet shells easily pierced the Japanese tanks from twice that distance. Japanese reports recorded dozens of Ha-Gos destroyed in minutes. Crews, often trapped inside flaming hulls, learned that their once trusted armor offered no protection against modern ordnance. The defeat at Khe Sanh was a profound shock to the Japanese military establishment. In total, roughly 120 Japanese tanks were destroyed or abandoned, compared with fewer than 80 Soviet BTs. Colonel Tamato Yoshimaru's after-action report identified 3 fatal weaknesses: inadequate armor, insufficient firepower, and lack of radio coordination. Despite these findings, the Army's senior leadership dismissed the results as anomalous, a localized failure due to terrain and numerical inferiority rather than design flaws. Japanese strategists, still focused on operations against China and colonial targets in Southeast Asia, continued to emphasize light armor. In parallel, Mitsubishi engineers explored incremental upgrades. The Type 97 Chiha, a medium tank mounting a 57mm low-velocity gun and 25mm armor, entered service in 1938 as a complement to the Ha-Go, not a replacement. Both models would remain Japan's principal tanks through 1945. By 1941, the Ha-Go formed the backbone of the Imperial Army's armored regiments, deployed across China, Manchuria, Korea, and Indochina. Tankers received extensive jungle and river crossing training, reflecting expectations of future campaigns in tropical regions, rather than open continental warfare. When war broke out with the Western Allies in December 1941, more than 1,000 Ha-Gos stood ready. The first 6 months of the Pacific War seemed to vindicate Japan's faith in the light tank concept. In the Malayan campaign, Colonel Sonoda's tank regiment used Ha-Gos to spearhead rapid advances down narrow jungle roads that British intelligence had deemed impassable for armor. British and Indian defenders lacking anti-tank guns were repeatedly flanked. At the Battle of Jitra in December 1941, Ha-Gos overran positions at night, their diesel engines muffled compared with British Stuarts. Similar success followed in the Philippines, where Type 95 supported the 14th Army under General Homa Masaharu against poorly equipped Philippine and American units armed primarily with 37mm M3 anti-tank guns. The Ha-Go still performed adequately. Its small silhouette, speed, and ability to cross soft ground gave Japanese commanders confidence that their design philosophy remained sound. By early 1942, the Type 95 Ha-Go symbolized Japan's early war victories. Light, fast, and reliable. Yet beneath the triumph lay a growing technological gap. one that would soon become fatal. As Japan's campaigns widened after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Type 95 Hago became the most widely deployed armored vehicle in the Imperial Army. Each infantry division assigned to operations in Southeast Asia carried at least one tank company, and independent tank regiments were formed to spearhead assaults across Burma, Malaya, and the Philippines. In these tropical environments, the Hago's lightweight and air-cooled diesel engine proved advantages. It could cross wooden bridges that heavier Allied tanks could not, maneuver through rice paddies, and operate for long periods without the cooling failures that plagued liquid-cooled engines in humid climates. In Malaya, Japanese forces under Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita achieved one of the most rapid armored advances of the Second World War. During the December 1941 invasion, columns of Hagos from the 3rd Tank Group supported infantry moving down the peninsula at astonishing speed. British commanders had dismissed the dense jungles as tank-proof, yet Japanese engineers improvised corduroy roads and pontoon crossings. At the Battle of Jitra, 11–13 December 1941, British defenders using obsolete light Mech 6 tanks and limited 2-pounder anti-tank guns were overwhelmed. The Hago's 37mm gun easily destroyed soft-skinned vehicles and bunkers, while its mobility allowed flanking through swampy ground. The same pattern repeated at Kampar and Slim River, where Hagos dashed across narrow roads at night, breaking through defensive lines and causing panic among retreating Allied troops. By February 1942, British forces had been driven into Singapore, and the Japanese tank arm was celebrated as the instrument of a modern lightning victory. In the Philippines, similar success followed. At the Battle of Bastogne, 1942, Type 95 supported infantry assaults against entrenched American and Filipino defenders. Although U.S. forces possessed M3 Stuart light tanks armed with comparable 37mm guns, the Japanese often gained the initiative through superior tactical coordination. In engagements near Abucay and Pilar, Hagos maneuvered around defensive positions rather than engaging in direct tank-on-tank duels. When clashes did occur, results were mixed. The M3's thicker armor could deflect the Japanese 37mm rounds, while the American gun penetrated the Hago at nearly any range. Nevertheless, because of numerical and logistical superiority, Japanese forces captured the Philippines by mid-1942. The early months of the war reinforced Tokyo's belief that its light tanks remained effective. Japanese propagandists portrayed the Hago as a symbol of efficiency and imperial ingenuity, proof that smaller, disciplined crews could triumph through skill and courage rather than sheer firepower. The Imperial Army, still constrained by limited industrial capacity, emphasized quality of spirit, sation over material weight. Development of heavier tanks continued slowly, but resources were diverted to naval shipbuilding and aircraft. From 1942 to 1943, the Hago fought across Burma and the Dutch East Indies. In the jungles of Arakan and along the Sitang River, Type 95s battled British and Indian forces equipped with light Stuart tanks and 2-pounder guns. Terrain limited engagements to narrow roads or village clearings, where Japanese crews often used surprise and darkness to offset inferior armor. Yet as Allied anti-tank tactics improved, losses mounted. British 6-pounder guns, introduced in 1943, could destroy Hagos at over 1,000 meters. In New Guinea, mud, disease, and Allied air superiority rendered armored units ineffective. By late 1943, reports from field commanders described entire tank companies immobilized by lack of spare parts and chronic engine wear. Strategically, Japan's armored doctrine had reached its limit, while Germany pursued combined arms warfare with radio-linked panzer formations. Japanese armor remained tied to infantry pace. Communication between tanks relied on visual signals or runners, making coordinated maneuvers nearly impossible under fire. Crew protection also lagged behind. Japanese designers retained riveted armor plates which, when struck, produced deadly interior spall. By 1943, captured examples examined by the Allies confirmed the Hago's vulnerabilities. U.S. intelligence manuals noted that even heavy machine gun fire could perforate the tank's side armor at moderate range. Despite these warnings, the Type 95 continued in frontline service simply because no replacement existed in sufficient quantity. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank offered slightly thicker armor and a low-velocity 57mm gun. But production was slow, and Japan's industry could not retool rapidly under Allied bombing and resource shortages. Thus, by 1944, most island garrisons from the Marianas to the Philippines still relied on the aging Hago as their principal armored weapon. The critical test came on the island of Saipan, part of the Mariana chain, in June 1944. Strategically vital as a base for American B-29 Superfortress bombers, Saipan represented the outer ring of Japan's homeland defense. The Imperial Japanese Army's 43rd Division, reinforced by the 9th Tank Regiment under Colonel Takashi Goto, prepared to repel the U.S. Marine invasion. Among their 44 tanks were approximately 30 Type 95 Hagos and a smaller number of Type 97 Chihas. When U.S. forces landed on 15th June, Japanese defenders waited for nightfall to counterattack. At 03:30 on 17 June 1944, Goto's regiment launched what would become the largest tank assault ever conducted by Japanese forces in the Pacific. Under cover of darkness, the column advanced along the coastal plain near Charan, Kanoa. American Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions, entrenched behind sand berms, detected the rumble of approaching engines and illuminated the field with flares. What followed was a textbook example of technological disparity overwhelming courage. As the silhouettes of Japanese tanks emerged, Marine gunners opened fire with 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 37mm anti-tank weapons, and M4 Sherman tanks. To the astonishment of U.S. crews, the 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds penetrated the Hago's frontal plates, igniting fuel and ammunition. Japanese crews confined in steel compartments barely large enough to turn their heads were annihilated before reaching effective range. Those who pressed closer met Sherman tanks whose 75mm guns destroyed Hagos with a single shot. Within minutes, the night sky glowed from burning diesel fires. By dawn, 31 of the 9th Tank Regiment's 44 vehicles lay destroyed. The outcome shocked both sides. For the Marines, the ease with which infantry weapons had defeated enemy tanks altered tactical doctrine. From that point forward, machine gun teams were trained to engage Japanese armor confidently. For the Japanese command, Saipan revealed a strategic catastrophe. The belief that morale could compensate for inferior materials had reached its breaking point. Post-battle analyses recovered hulls perforated cleanly by small-caliber rounds. Engineers confirmed that the Hago's 12mm armor could not resist the Browning's 23mm penetration at 200 meters. In Tokyo, reports from Saipan caused quiet alarm within the Army's Technical Bureau. Plans for heavier models, the Type 3 Chi-Nu and Type 4 Chi-To, were accelerated, yet industrial disruption and material shortages rendered them symbolic gestures. Only a few prototypes were completed and none reached Saipan or the Philippines. The Imperial General Staff continued to deploy Hagos where possible, often entrenching them as static bunkers rather than mobile assets. The Battle of Saipan also demonstrated the overwhelming production gap between Japan and the United States. While Japanese industry had produced approximately 2,300 Hagos since 1936, American factories were manufacturing up to 2,000 Sherman tanks every month by 1944. The Detroit Tank Arsenal alone built 896 vehicles in January 1944, nearly half of Japan's total wartime tank output. This industrial imbalance ensured that no amount of tactical ingenuity could alter the outcome of future engagements. In the months following Saipan, surviving Hagos were relegated to secondary roles. On Guam and Tinian, they fought brief delaying actions before being destroyed. At Peleliu in September 1944, tanks from the 14th Division attempted counterattacks against entrenched Marines, but were wiped out within minutes. By the end of that year, the Type 95's operational life as a frontline vehicle was effectively over. The psychological impact on Japanese tankers was profound. Memoirs recovered after the war described disbelief that weapons once dominant in China could be rendered obsolete overnight. A captured officer from Saipan later told interrogators he believed the Americans had developed a new explosive bullet. In truth, it was the same Browning M2 that had been in service since 1933, a weapon whose effectiveness underscored the stagnation of Japan's armored Dizin. Saipan marked the death of the Type 95 Hago not only as a machine but as a doctrine. It exposed the fatal flaw in Japan's pre-war strategic culture, the assumption that courage and training could compensate for technological inferiority. From 1933 to 1944, the Hago had embodied the Imperial Army's vision of fast, disciplined warfare. On Saipan, that vision collapsed under the weight of industrial modernity. By the end of 1944, the Type 95 Hago was a relic on the modern battlefield, yet necessity compelled Japan to continue using it wherever armor was still fielded. The Empire's strategic position had deteriorated dramatically. American carrier forces had achieved naval supremacy in the Pacific, and U.S. B-29 bombers now struck the home islands from the newly captured Marianas. Japan's wartime economy, strained by blockade and the loss of Southeast Asian resources, could no longer sustain heavy manufacturing. Steel output fell by more than half between 1943 and 1945. Rubber, copper, and fuel became critically scarce. As the air war intensified, transportation networks were bombed relentlessly, severing supply lines between factories and front lines. Within this collapsing system, tank production slowed to a crawl. The Mitsubishi Sagami Arsenal, once responsible for assembling hundreds of Hagos annually, shifted focus to repairs and experimental prototypes. The Type 3 Chi-Nu, intended to replace the obsolete Chi-Ha and Hago, entered production in late 1944, but in minuscule numbers. Fewer than 170 were completed. The Type 4 Chito and Type 5 Chi-Ri, advanced designs featuring high-velocity 75mm and 88mm guns respectively, never progressed beyond prototype stage. Lacking materials for new vehicles, the Imperial Army ordered older models to be modified for defensive operations. Some Hagos had their turrets removed and were buried up to the hull as fixed bunkers. Others were mounted on static platforms to serve as coastal defense guns. As the Allies advanced toward the Philippines in late 1944, Japanese armor units faced an impossible task. During the Battle of Leyte, elements of the 1st Tank Division, equipped with roughly 50 Hagos and Chi-Has, attempted to oppose General MacArthur's landing forces. U.S. Shermans and M10 tank destroyers, supported by naval gunfire, obliterated them within hours. On Luzon, the pattern repeated. Japanese tanks were used as immobile obstacles, often destroyed before firing a shot. American after-action reports described entire armored regiments neutralized by airstrikes or bazooka teams before engaging ground troops. By 1945, Japan's tank warfare capability had effectively ceased to exist. The final months of combat on Iwo Jima, February 1945, and Okinawa, April-June 1945, demonstrated both the persistence and futility of the Hago. On Iwo Jima, Colonel Baron Takechi Nishi, a 1932 Olympic equestrian champion, commanded the 26th Tank Regiment, which possessed 22 Type 95s and Type 97s. Anticipating total U.S. air superiority, Nishi ordered his tanks buried in the island's volcanic ash up to their turrets, converting them into concealed pillboxes. When the U.S. Marines landed on 19th of February 1945, these tanks opened fire only once the Americans were within 300 meters. Their 37mm and 57mm guns inflicted minimal damage against Shermans. Return fire and flamethrowers silenced them quickly. Within 3 days, the regiment ceased to exist as a fighting unit. At Okinawa, the largest ground battle of the Pacific War, the Hago appeared again. For the last time in organized combat, the 27th Tank Regiment, fielding 27 tanks, launched a counterattack on 4th May 1945 against American positions near Shuri. Facing approximately 800 Shermans, M10s, and M18 Hellcats, the Japanese assault disintegrated in less than 2 hours. American gunners destroyed or disabled every Hago encountered. Many Japanese crews fought to the death rather than abandon their vehicles. Subsequent analysis found that even 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, when used in a direct fire role, could penetrate the Hago's armor cleanly. The pattern of defeat underscored Japan's industrial and doctrinal limitations. The Imperial Army had never invested in a comprehensive armored command structure comparable to the German Panzerwaffe or the U.S. Armored Force. Tank units were scattered piecemeal among infantry formations, with little emphasis on maintenance or logistics. Spare parts shortages forced crews to cannibalize wrecks, while inadequate training left many inexperienced in mechanical repair or combined arms tactics. In contrast, Allied armored units operated within a vast logistical network that could replace vehicles within days. When Japan surrendered on 15 August 1945, fewer than 400 serviceable Hagos remained across all theaters. Many were rusting in jungle depots or buried as fortifications in island garrisons that had never seen combat. The tank that once symbolized Japan's mechanized modernity had become a museum piece even before the war ended. Allied intelligence teams, including those from the U.S. Army Ordnance Department and British Royal Armored Corps, examined captured examples throughout 1945 and 1946. Their reports described the Hago as technically primitive but mechanically reliable. They praised its diesel engine for simplicity and fuel efficiency, but criticized every other feature. Riveted armor vulnerable to spalling, weak armament, absence of radio, and cramped interior conditions. In post-war historiography, the Type 95 Hago came to represent both the ingenuity and the blind spots of Japan's pre-1945 industrial policy. On one hand, it demonstrated the nation's ability to mass-produce a dependable vehicle with limited resources. On the other, it embodied the fatal assumption that light armor and courage could substitute for engineering parity with Western powers. The lessons drawn from the Hago's failure influenced Japan's later defense philosophy during the Cold War. When the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force, JGSDF, was established in 1954, its first domestic tank, the Type 61, emphasized crew survivability, thicker armor, and high-velocity firepower, reflecting the technological lessons learned from wartime shortcomings. The Hago's battlefield performance also offers insight into the evolution of 20th-century armored warfare. During the 1930s, it was adequate for colonial policing and limited wars against poorly equipped adversaries. By 1944, it was obsolete against mass-produced Western armor supported by air power and industry. The Battle of Saipan serves as a case study in the intersection of technology and doctrine. A smaller force clinging to outdated equipment against an opponent whose industrial scale redefined modern warfare. From a technical standpoint, the Hago's greatest strengths were simplicity and range. Its air-cooled diesel engine could operate in climates that disabled many Western vehicles. Crews reported low maintenance needs and good fuel economy. These advantages, however, could not compensate for its strategic weaknesses. The absence of communications rendered coordinated attacks impossible, while the 37mm Type 94 gun, once formidable, became useless against Allied tanks after 1942. Japanese engineers understood this and attempted incremental upgrades such as fitting the later Type 98 and Type 100 guns with higher muzzle velocity, but production bottlenecks and raw material shortages ensured few reached combat. Throughout 1945, scattered Hagos continued to appear in China and Southeast Asia, often in local garrisons or puppet army service. In Manchuria, during the brief Soviet invasion of August 1945, Soviet T-34-85 medium tanks destroyed hundreds of Japanese armored vehicles, including Hagos, with minimal losses. The engagement reaffirmed the massive gulf between pre-war Japanese engineering and late-war Soviet design. In the post-war decades, surviving Hagos were studied by historians, engineers, and collectors. Several examples were preserved in museums: the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia, the Bovington Tank Museum in England, the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor in Kentucky, and the Yushuken War Museum in Tokyo. Their compact silhouettes, hand-riveted hulls, and Spartan interiors offer tangible reminders of a military era built on improvisation and national ambition rather than material dominance. Historically, the Type 95 Hago stands as both a success and a warning. It succeeded in fulfilling its original specification: a light, fast, and dependable tank for 1930s Asia. It failed when asked to fight a mechanized world war against powers that could build hundreds of thousands of vehicles and sustain them with infinite logistics. Its story encapsulates Japan's broader wartime paradox: tactical brilliance amid strategic overreach. Technologically, the Hago influenced later developments in diesel engine design and suspension systems. The bell-crank Hara suspension, refined through wartime experience, later evolved into designs used in Japan's post-war armored vehicles. Its simplicity made it a model for light tank engineering in resource-limited environments. Yet the fundamental lesson remained: mobility without protection or communication renders a tank little more than a moving target. By the time the Pacific War ended, the Hago had fought from China to Burma, from New Guinea to Saipan, and from the Philippines to Okinawa. It had served in temperatures ranging from the frozen plains of Mongolia to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. It was a machine born in the optimism of 1933 and buried in the ashes of 1945. In the end, its legacy was not measured in victories, but in the clarity it gave historians and engineers about the limits of industrial strategy in total war. Where German and American tanks embodied progress through innovation, the Hago stood as a reminder of what happens when doctrine outruns technology. From the factories of Nagoya to the jungles of Malaya, from the steppes of Khalkhin-Gol to the shores of Saipan, the Type 95 Hago fought in every major campaign Japan undertook. It served as a tool of empires, a weapon of expansion, and ultimately a symbol of decline. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, its story was complete, a chronicle of engineering ambition undone by the relentless logic of modern warfare.